Good morning, friends. In this video, I'm going to answer some of your questions about how protein consumption affects longevity and health. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video to help with the channel's growth. Now let's get started. First of all, I apologize for the delay in making this third part of, I guess, a short series on protein. I originally didn't intend to make it a series, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't leaving anyone hanging and there weren't any questions from individual subscribers who may not have the same background information as the rest of us, so may still have some questions. I didn't want any of those questions to remain unanswered. So what I did here was that I had originally made a post on my Instagram asking for questions, specific questions regarding protein. I collected all of the questions there that I think may not have been completely answered in the previous two videos. I'll answer those questions here, and then I've also collected some questions from around everywhere, from the YouTube comment section, from other posts on Instagram, which I may answer, some of which afterwards in this discussion. The point here is basically to have a relaxed discussion so we can get to the same page in terms of our understanding of how we may want to manipulate protein consumption depending on our goals in life. Alright, the first question we'll take is from my friend Tony Huge. He says, I think the heart and brain would be the two most important organs to be concerned with and cover whether excessive protein ages them and how. The rest of the organs are more easily fixed or less important. I think the two organs, the brain and the heart, are certainly the most important organs, but I would question whether other organs are easily fixed. Usually when you have dysfunction in other organs, you cause more dysfunction across the body, which then harms the very important organs like the heart. So for example, if you have poorly functioning kidneys, you have more uremic toxins in your bloodstream, and you're experiencing heart damage over time. And brain damage as well. So I wouldn't be so comfortable with damaging the other organs. But about the brain and the heart, so does having high protein in your diet damage the brain and the heart? There's some evidence that having mTOR dysregulated, constantly on, that growth signal, may cause damage to the brain, for example. This is involved in the etiology of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, in which misfolded proteins, if you remember, proteostasis is harmed when mTOR is always on and aging. So it's certainly the case that the brain may be damaged by having mTOR on all the time. The reverse, though, is also true, as I mentioned earlier. Having mTOR completely off all the time may cause degeneration in the brain or atrophy over time, as individual cells are killed throughout our lives, but you birth less new cells because you've stopped mTOR locally in the brain. By the way, I should make a comment here. You could have mTOR activated in some organs of your body, but not in other organs. So when you eat a high protein diet, you activate mTOR sort of generally. When you take, for example, lithium as a supplement, or valproate, or an SSRI, you locally raise mTOR specifically in the nervous system. So if you were taking one of those things that specifically raises mTOR in the nervous system, and then you raise your protein in your diet slightly, you'd get more of a protective effect on your brain than other people would from the same amount of protein. You can localize where that mTOR goes. About the heart, generally, we would think that if mTOR is turned off for long enough, there would be atrophy of the heart, of the myocytes in the heart, just like there is atrophy in the brain. But interestingly, there seems to be evidence of the reverse from epidemiologic studies and observational studies. It seems to be that humans that have mTOR always turned up end up with heart disease. Now this may be because the strongest way or the most powerful way to turn on mTOR through your diet is through animal proteins, which also have a high amount of saturated fats or may produce TMA or something else. So it's a little bit less clear there with regard to the heart. But anyway, I think Tony is right. You have to pay attention to the heart and the brain, and I thought to talk this out with you guys so you could see some of the ways I'm thinking about the subject, in case it helps. Next, Nabil Ansari says, if someone's looking to put on muscle and higher protein consumption ages us prematurely, what would be the best way to do it without affecting longevity too much? Or is that a compromise one has to make to gain muscle? This is a great question, Nabil. What I would say personally, I'm no expert on gaining muscle, and I've never been a bodybuilder or anything like that. And I'm not really an expert on longevity either. I'm just very interested in it. What I would do personally, if it was under my control, and I wanted to gain muscle that I had never gained before. You see, this is an important point as well. Once you gain the amount of muscle you want, and keep it for 6 months to a year, you will find it much easier to regain that amount of muscle, or you'll find it easier to maintain that amount of muscle with a lower protein diet. But if you want to gain muscle that you've never gained before, you may have to use higher protein consumption for short periods of time, but honestly, you may be able to gain the muscle a little bit slower without even raising your protein that high. You may find that if you train to maximize your hypertrophy of your muscles, but maintain protein a little bit lower, you will eventually reach that goal. At least you'll reach the maximal hypertrophic muscular state that you can have at that protein amount. And then you could raise your protein for short time periods to try to gain more and then lower it. Do you see what I mean? Keep in mind, it's not harmful for your health. Well, I suppose it could be harmful for your health if you really want to think about it. It could be harmful for your health to have a lot of muscle. The reason why is if you have a lot of muscle, your body has to constantly be involved in this manipulation of proteostasis. It has to be constantly trying to digest proteins, synthesize proteins, change proteins, because you carry just so much more protein than a normal person. This could put your kidneys at risk in the long term. It could do other things as well. But generally speaking, having a higher amount of muscle is not known to be unhealthy. In fact, it's protective for various reasons, including protecting against diabetes. What I would say is the amount of muscle you can gain without having a high protein diet is necessarily healthy. So if you gain that amount of muscle and you never raised your protein up high, you don't really have to worry about whether you're really harming your health. Because at least that's the way I think of it. You'll have excess muscle, which can help your health a lot. And even if you turned on mTOR on more, it'll be sort of cyclical because you weren't eating a high protein diet throughout your waking hours. Next, Obar says, do you think you could give your opinion on whether having a little extra muscle from the help of protein would help longevity compared to having less muscle but eating less protein, if that's the case? I think that it really depends on the context, maybe also on someone's genetics, someone's background, someone's health. But generally, I think that having more muscle, if you're very hectic with your diet, you can't control yourself, you do unreasonable things like over consuming glucose suddenly, stuff like that, having muscle in that context may be healthier. And when you're older, above the age of 60 or so, and at risk of falls being very traumatic for your body and so on, at that point also raising protein may be protective for you. I think that having a high protein diet or being muscular for the general population that isn't nutrient deficient probably isn't better for their health. And I know this sounds really surprising. I have a video, by the way, on how exercise affects longevity. You'll be surprised to note that, first of all, elite athletes are generally speaking a little bit unhealthier than the average population. The most elite in the extreme sports, like really extreme endurance running, strongmen, powerlifters, stuff like that. Elite endurance athletes that are not in extreme sports seem to have better health than the average. This is in the aerobic sports. Elite powerlifters and strength athletes oftentimes have more heart disease deaths than the average population. You know, sports aren't all healthy by necessity. It depends how you approach it. It's the same thing with having muscle. It depends how you got that muscle and how you maintain it. At least that's what I think. Next, Bury Me in Smoke says, in that paper they specifically mentioned BCAAs and EAAs. I realize I'm getting these from meat, but more specifically, would you say I'm slowly poisoning myself by sipping a BCAA or EAA intra-workout drink? Your comments about middle-aged people... Wait, let's stop. This is a great question. Why in the world would you be sipping an EAA or BCAA? By the way, what are those? Branched chain amino acids are 3 amino acids, which are contained within the set of essential amino acids, which are 9 amino acids, which are contained within the set of amino acids. The question is, why would you be sipping amino acids during your workout? You might be sipping them because you need building blocks, but if so, this would really, I think, only be helpful if you're on a protein-restricted diet. If you're on a protein-restricted diet, you may not have enough amino acids moving around in your bloodstream or enough availability of them to be able to respond properly to stress. But if not, the effect of turning on mTOR by sipping these amino acids during your workout, first of all, if that was the effect you're looking for, leucine, or as we'll talk about later, bileucine, which is 2 leucines combined together, may be more effective for that. But also, working out turns on mTOR. Strength activity turns on mTOR. Or strength activities, weightlifting for strength turns on mTOR. It raises adrenaline levels, turns on mTOR. That's how growth hormone increases when you squat. So you're turning on mTOR already there. So that doesn't make sense. The real poison, I would say, is sipping on the EAs or BCs throughout your day. Waking up and sipping on EAs or BCs. That's a poison. Doing it intra-workout, the mTOR is already turned on. You're probably not causing much harm to your body or much of a difference. You're probably not changing much. But taking it in the daytime, some period when you're not eating, that inhibits your ability to go into that cellular repair pathway. that forces you to stay on mTOR. Sort of like those senescent cells force mTOR to be activated constantly. That I would call poison, really, and that's a bad idea for your health. Anyway, my point is sipping BCAAs or EAs which activate mTOR, although not very efficiently as we saw earlier, or not perfectly, or not maybe the best combination to activate mTOR, but they activate mTOR, is probably not healthy for you, maybe poisonous in times during the day when you might have gotten into cellular repair. Not during your workout, unless the workout was aerobic. If you were doing endurance aerobic workouts and sipping on amino acids, yeah, that would be also poisoning yourself, in my opinion. All right, next, before we continue, Bury Me and Smoke had another question. He said, your comments about middle-aged people with awful aches and pains who eat a lot of protein rang true to me, but I have to say that subjectively, the best my joints and tendons have ever felt was while on the carnivore diet when I was eating even more protein but zero carbs. The reason for that is not because of the carbohydrates. The reason for that is probably because you had a lot less cellular inflammation in your body. And that's why your joints hurt less. Remember, the joints aching because of high protein diets doesn't happen acutely. It's not because of inflammation from the high protein diet. It's from the long-term effects of creating more senescent cells. So these senescent cells also will hurt you less if you switch to a ketogenic diet or some kind of diet that lowers inflammation in the body acutely. But you're still going to have those senescent cells. So high protein diets cause inflammation and joint pain in the long term, not acutely. And they cause those damages that can be alleviated slightly acutely, but still exist there. On the other hand, the ketogenic diet may reduce brain fog by lowering inflammation in the brain, may reduce your joint aches like it does to me personally also. And the way it's doing all of this is through reducing inflammation. Remember, a lot of the pain we feel is due to inflammation and not due to the actual long-term changes, structural changes in our body. Even inflammation that comes from senescent cells. So acutely lowering inflammation will mask this effect. Next, Robert P. 1984 says, would be interested in knowing if intermittent fasting, OMAD, would minimize the aging versus constant flow of protein all day, both equaling 1 gram per pound of body weight daily. Basically what he's saying is, if I ate all my protein in one meal during the day, but it was the same amount of protein as I ate throughout my waking hours, would I minimize the damaging effects of the protein on my health? You would, certainly. The main problem that everybody seems to be noticing, it seems to be from mTOR being activated, is simply the fact of it being activated all the time, or as much as your waking hours allow. So if you ate I wouldn't suggest eating everything in one meal, but I would, personally, I really think the optimal thing is something between 4 to 8 hours of eating. If you do that, depending on what you eat, you may get into a low nutrient sensing pathway later on during the day or at some point of the day where you go into cellular repair. So limiting the time period of eating is, I think, personally very helpful and a good way to mitigate for the negative effects of turning on mTOR strongly. Next, Matt Murphy says, do you think that the aging process on skin or organ systems from a previously high protein diet can be reversed if a higher vegetable-based low protein diet is incorporated? I think so, in some small way. So for example, when we fast, we put our body in a state where it wants to kill damaged cells, okay, and it wants to recycle damaged proteins. So it wants to commit autophagy to like misfolded proteins. It wants to kill cells that have damaged DNA that may turn into cancerous cells. So these are some of the effects of having a high protein diet long term. So going really low protein, like in a fast, a periodic fast, may kill some of those cells and help get us back to baseline. But do I really think that we're going to get back to baseline? We can erase that damage. It depends on how much damage you did. But if you were like me, and from the age of 15 or so, we're trying to eat 200 grams to 300 grams of protein a day at least, and sometimes you eat 400 grams or so, you're probably going to have seriously changed your body. I genetically, in my family, have a lot of white hair. I think it has something to do with poor melanocortin receptors or melanin synthesis or something like that. But my graying of my hairs was influenced by my protein consumption. I could see it change over the years that I was consuming a lot of protein, I had mTOR turned on a lot, and so on. Now, I could potentially kill some of these damaged melanin synthesizing cells that are related to my white hair, but can you imagine me reversing all my white hair? It's very unlikely. In the same way, it's unlikely for you to undo this small, intricate damage that happened, accumulated through years of high protein diets. Next, the Human Typhoon says, no, I would like to live in denial and die a slightly muscled man in my 60s. I have known about the aging effects of protein since David Sinclair was on Rogan. But similar to Vigorous Steve, I love the bodybuilding lifestyle. I don't use PEDs, and although it is not optimal for longevity, a higher protein diet is conducive for my mental well-being. Obviously, okay, I have comments there, but he said, obviously you're called Leo in longevity for a reason, so I get where you're coming from, but there are people out there like myself that are willing to make the trade-off. Love your channel, Leo. Okay, the humanoid typhoon, that was a great comment. I thought it would be fun to discuss a little bit. Look at how I'm thinking of it. I've actually never really talked about my own personal preferences on the channel that much, to be honest with you. I do love the idea of living a very long time and being healthy throughout that time period. I do love that. And that is one of the reasons my channel is called Leo on Longevity. But I don't prioritize that over living a life that I feel valuable or that I like to live. So I do prioritize my personal experience on a daily basis. I would not want to live a life of depression because I crushed mTOR so I could live longer, but my brain was depressed. That's not, in fact, brother, the main reason why I'm interested in the brain is specifically because of this. My main interest in the brain is because I think that the major mediator of how we enjoy our lives or experience our lives is our brain. And so if we can improve brain function, we can improve our ability to be happy or to be satisfied or so on with our lives. So I really prioritize what we call health span, the number of years of healthy living. And within health span, I'm really prioritizing how subjective well-being is. So I'm with you on this. I wouldn't want to have a low protein diet if it made me depressed or something else like that. But I think we have some differences of opinion there. First of all, high protein diets don't need to make you mentally less effective. In fact, you will find that you will have a more effective cognitive function on a truly ketogenic diet. That means a diet low in protein and low in carbohydrates that has some polypharmacy that upregulates maybe some mTOR in your brain locally. So for example, you could lower your protein completely to lower mTOR in your brain, or you could first of all go on a ketogenic diet which lowers mTOR in the brain but lowers inflammation in the brain also, making you have clearer thinking, and then you could raise mTOR in the brain with something specific. There are many drugs that can do so. So my point there is that a low protein diet doesn't have to cause depression in the brain or even lower mTOR in the brain. You can specifically raise mTOR in certain areas of the body while lowering mTOR generally. That's my experience and what I can see from research papers. Now also about dying a slightly muscled man for subjective well-being. That part I disagree with. I think that if you once during your lifetime become, now of course there are a lot of people that are different than this. There are some people that I think because they got muscular very early in life and they stayed muscular for like a decade, it's difficult for them to lose that part of their identity. But if you're not one of those people and you were only muscular for 3 or 4 years, if you were properly muscular, I bet you'll get over the issue of being muscular like I did. You won't care too much about it anymore. You'll have been happy. I'm very happy that I was muscular for a time period, that I did feel strong, because I have always wanted to experience that since I was a child. So you'll be happy you had that experience, but I feel like once you had that experience, you'll be able to move past it. You know that there's a reason there aren't 50-year-olds that are as muscular as you were when you were 30, and you know that you have to move on with that. And also you know further, let me point out something else. In life, if you want to have the most pleasure possible or the most happiness long term and the least of a depressing later life, you can't focus on the physical. The physical degrades earlier in life than the mental. If you invest in your brain as opposed to your body, you won't have a depressing 30s or 40s or 50s. In fact, they'll get better. Your 30s will be better than your 20s. Your 40s will be better than your 30s. Your 50s could be better than your 40s, even though you're slightly less sharp, but you've accomplished more with your brain in the long term and have more wisdom. So really focusing on the body, I feel like there's no reason to want to die slightly muscular. It doesn't even make sense or matter. And also I'd like to point out something. While being muscular, and we were just talking about only how muscle affects the person themselves, but how it affects you socially, while having muscle does help you in your social contact with men, I'm sure, especially if you're a YouTuber. Apparently, it's very helpful if you're a YouTuber. But in general, men respect other men that are more muscular. But if you are a young man and you're interested in dating women or you're not married yet, let me tell you something. The hardest dating I ever had in my lifetime was when I was more muscular. Now, in my case, this might have been a little bit worse because I was heavily tattooed and muscular and living in Los Angeles, which is a liberal place. But I just want to point out to you that surprisingly, in this age, having muscle as a man may make it much more difficult for you actually to get a date. This was at least my experience. It was much more difficult, at least to get a date with a woman. On the other hand, being approached by men everywhere I went was very common. So I just want to, I mean, this is not important. And I know you guys aren't gaining muscle mainly for women, but if you are, it's getting in your way, just so you know. And if you're gaining muscle because you want to have fun with it and live your life, I bet you having muscle for 3 or 4 years would be enough, and you wouldn't have to keep maintaining it for the rest of your life. Finally, this gentleman who made this comment seems to be natural. If you're natural and eating a high protein diet, things are very different. You may be genetically, first of all, predisposed to not turning on mTOR that powerfully. So you may not be even getting that much out of the high protein diet in the first place, which may be why you feel like you need a higher protein diet for mental focus and so on. But I would point out that if you're natural and not on drugs, as long as you have some hours away from a high protein diet, so you have time restricted eating or you fast every so often, you're going to go into those cellular repair pathways. Unless you have issues with your genetics, you're not forcing mTOR on all the time. Unless you are really like wake up in the middle of the night like some bodybuilders do to drink protein and so on. But those guys are usually using steroids. So I'm assuming you're not doing that. If you're not, then this is all a little bit less extreme for you than those people who are really seriously trying to be as big as they can be. And the next comment's from Dino Page Music. Dino says, I don't even care how bad protein is for you. I'm here for a good time, not a long time, and I'm gonna have a good time being jacked and juicy. Well, this is unfortunate. This is very unfortunate. First of all, let me tell you something. I don't regret using steroids. I think it was fun for me specifically. I read so much about them for years. I was so interested in it. So when I used them, I had a great time. Even though I didn't have the best genetics to respond to them, I wasn't really trying to be a super athlete or anything like that. So I don't regret taking them. But you don't have to take them and ruin your life for it. I used Tren for 6 months. I'm not planning to die at 50. You don't have to do so either, unless you want to be a huge, very muscular bodybuilder. If that's what he's trying to say here, he wants to live a short life and a fun life, I would still question whether being a big, huge bodybuilder like that is worth it for you. I really don't think it's the best way to have fun in life, to be honest with you. When you're that big, you're not there mentally. Your soul, who you are, is less functional. You'll notice you're groggy, you're slow, you're barely alive. So that's my opinion really on that being the best way to live. But about prioritizing your early years compared to your later years. I nearly made an Instagram post about this the other day. I wanted to comment for younger people that may not know this. When you're young, you may think that, my 20s are the years, because after that my body starts to deteriorate. So my 20s are really the years that are most important in my life. I should weigh these years more in my objective function than the later years. This is not really true. It is true if you really don't prepare for the period after your 20s. So if you're like, you just rob H&Ms for money throughout your 20s and you do nothing for your future, and you harm your body such that in your 30s you have worse physical function. It may be true then for you, because you screwed up your 20s and your 30s and 40s, that your 20s may be the most important years. So deciding to live a shorter life, you could end up making truly your earlier years better than your later years. But if you don't decide to do that, if you invest in your 30s and 40s, especially as a man, this is less true for women who are hedonistic than men who are also hedonistic. Even if you're hedonistic, you may find that your 30s and 40s are more fun than your 20s. And not only that, and this is what I wanted to point out clearly, if you raise mTOR all the time in your 20s, unless you have certain genetic polymorphisms, which come as a set, they were mostly discovered by Nir Barzilai and his research team that were studying centenarians at Albert Einstein University and also in Israel. What they found was there were certain single nucleotide polymorphisms, mutations, which were so protective that they were found frequently among centenarians. And these were the genes that you could find among centenarians who had, for example, the ApoE4 polymorphism, but still lived to centenarian age, or who smoked but still lived to centenarian age. These guys who seem invulnerable to daily life stress, they look younger as centenarians. They look like they're 80 but they're 100. When they're 80 they look 60. There are these mutations. If you have these mutations, It may be the case that eating more protein and turning on mTOR all the time, not giving your body a chance to get into the cellular repair mechanisms for normal people, in your case may not be as harmful. In your case, those cellular repair mechanisms, for example, one of these polymorphisms, mutations, is in the SIRT1 gene. That's a gene that David Sinclair always talks about, related to resveratrol. There are others, for example, in the IGF-1 receptor, others in the growth hormone receptor. So anyway, these things basically will make it such that even though you're not giving your body a chance to turn off mTOR, your body still turns it off. Your body still turns on those repair pathways, despite you. So if you're one of those people, you might need to care less about protein consumption and so on, and you might not actually feel worse in your 30s and 40s because of how much protein you ate in your 20s. But these people are rare. If you're another person like myself, what will happen is your body will start to break down little by little, quicker. You'll start to get autoimmune issues. You'll start to get gut issues. You'll start to get joint pain. You'll need some kind of small shoulder surgery. You'll need slowly things will start to get damaged in your body. But it'll happen quicker than if you didn't eat that high protein diet, than if you didn't eat less food, less calories, and so on. So really it depends on your genetics. If you're one of those centenarians, you might feel just as young at 40 as you did at 20, despite eating a high protein diet. So go check. And then Derek and I will come up with a product to quickly do this with an algorithm that'll be very cheap once you guys have your DNA. But if you don't know already about this, then you're most likely going to make yourself feel older by eating these diets. That's the problem. Even if you want to live a short time, because you think, oh, my 20s are my most important years, if you took care of yourself, your 20s would be less fun than your 30s and 40s, for sure, in almost all people. So if you wanted to maintain your health for your 20s, 30s, and 40s, now you have to care about protein consumption and calorie consumption. Because if you don't, unless you have those centenarian genes, in your 40s you're going to feel worse physically, like I do. I'm in my 30s, but I get aches and all these kind of things. I don't have the energy that I did in my 20s. You could have the energy. So you could have more money, more friends, more established life, all that kind of stuff. If you want to live a short life and party or whatever, your parties would be more fun for you. So I just wanted to point this out to everybody. Your 30s and 40s are very important years, and you will feel worse in them unless you have those centenarian genes if you eat a high protein diet and high calories and eat throughout the day in your 20s. There's a question from Kevin Mountbatten, which is really interesting because Mountbatten was a name invented by the English royal family to give it to some of their German relatives, who there was antagonism toward Germans in Britain at the time. But he spells it Mountbatten. So I guess this is like a fake last name. But anyway, he says, does this mean that a carnivore diet ages you quicker in theory? In theory, maybe, but it depends how much you're eating. The problem with the thing we're not accounting for is that the carnivore diet leads you to eating way less calories. Remember, what turns on mTOR is not just amino acids, but total caloric consumption. Not carbohydrates, but total caloric consumption. So if you're going to eat way less in a carnivore diet, you may end up with less mTOR signaling overall. It hasn't been studied enough to know for sure. But I can tell you almost certainly that unless you're comparing the carnivore diet to a diet of caloric excess, it's probably going to be worse for many people's health. But when you compare it to a diet of caloric excess, because the carnivore diet makes people eat less, it will oftentimes probably be more healthy. Next, we have a question from Kyle Deschamps, I guess. He says, if one were to limit protein, wouldn't they be more likely to develop disease though, from all the excess carbs they'd need to eat and processed fats they wouldn't be able to get from the meat? So, first of all, the amount of carbohydrates generally in the diet does not seem to be associated with IGF-1 levels or mTOR. I don't know if you're talking about the excess carbohydrates being problematic because of you're imagining a certain kind of carbohydrate, something like sugar, table sugar. But there are other carbohydrates that are glucose. So the glucose isn't necessarily, high glucose diets aren't necessarily harmful for your health. Also, the fats in meats aren't particularly desirable. In fact, one of the theories for why red meat consumption may be bad for your health and may be associated with heart disease isn't the protein or the selection of amino acids in the red meat, but the amount of saturated fat in the red meat. Saturated fat has been shown to be neurotoxic in some models and to cause some issues in the body. In fact, it's not as simple as that. It really depends on the individual fatty acid. So there are steric and lauric saturated fats that influence our health opposingly. The problem is they're often combined together in meats. And really, I believe that supplementation of fats is a poorly, this market, people who create fats to supplement with, they don't have enough creativity. I have some ideas of creating fats that are like, for example, particularly isolated fatty acids like decanoic fatty acid, the C10, which agonizes the PPAR gamma receptor that telmisartan agonizes. You could combine decanoic acid, for example, with butyrate, which is a short chain fatty acid shown to be very helpful for health, or with stearic acid. These combined together could be an excellent health supplement. Unfortunately, nobody's pursuing it. By the way, if anyone makes this product with decanoic acid, stearic acid, and butyric acid, they're copying me. So I came up with this idea. I would like to make a product like that one day for myself. I would like to find out if you could potentially fry with this. There's a lot of things I'd like to look into. But anyway, so the point is, let's continue his question. He says, I'm curious to see who would live longer. Someone on an animal-based diet that Carnivore MD 2.0 promotes, or somebody who eats little protein but a large portion of carbohydrates and restricts calorie intake. Well, I think it depends there on the calories. If you're not talking about calories at all between the two diets, it's difficult to predict. But if you're talking about the same amount of calories from both of those diets, studies across animals would lead you to think that the higher protein diet would cause more aging and an earlier death, and specifically cause the animals to look older when they're younger and act older when they're younger, which is what happens in these studies. So I don't think it's really, but the problem is, he's mentioning Carnivore MD. Carnivore MD, I don't know much about. I've watched a couple of discussions with him. He seems like a very nice guy, by the way. But I don't believe that there's somebody with a... keep in mind, medical doctors don't go through nutritional training in medical training. And medical doctors in general find it very difficult to read papers after they finish their medical degree because they have professions and so on. So I have a lot of medical doctors following the channel, of course, and I respect medical doctors a lot. But I'm just putting these caveats just to give an excuse to the carnivore gentleman. But I just want to point out, I don't understand how he really believes that eating a only animal protein diet with nothing else is optimal for longevity and health span in humans. What I mean to say is, I don't believe it's possible for somebody who's somewhat educated to think that when they read papers all day, unless they have either a psychological bias that is emotional, or they don't believe what they're really saying. So I'm not really, that's how much I disagree with this person's views. And although I respect him, seems like a nice guy and so on, I don't have any reason to think he's a bad person. But I disagree so much that it's like even almost nonsensical to respond to these kind of messages, because I'm imagining what he must be thinking to come up with these ideas, and he must be ignoring so much in cellular biology to come to these conclusions. I mean, it must be either emotional or intentional. Next, we have a question from Mar4000. He says, you say that you're going to feel much older from high protein, but that's not what's happening in the real world from what I can see. Well, that's because you're not reading studies. So if you look at the studies that use either rapamycin, metformin, or caloric restriction or protein restriction, you'll see the academics frequently remark on the fact that the mice or rats that lived longer also look remarkably younger and act remarkably more energetic and younger as they age. And this is found across the organisms, including the monkeys and the dogs, so it's a little shocking to think that only humans would have an opposite response. He says, as examples, Dr. Sean Baker, who eats tons of protein daily, seems to be doing well for his age. You need to, for this gentleman, I'd highly recommend Kahneman and Tversky's line of research called the Heuristics and Biases Perspective or something like that in microeconomics. You have to understand the confirmation bias and other cognitive biases we have. You can't use one example that is not experimental, not controlled, to say, hey, this guy eats a lot of protein, so he's living long. Dr. Sean Baker, I don't know who that is, but Dr. Sean Baker may have all of the genetic polymorphisms that seem to cause centenarians to be able to live to 100 years old while chain smoking. How would you know? So this is not a great example to provide to us, and neither would it be a good example if you provided 5 more. You're not being systematic and rigorous. Don't do this. Don't let your brain fool you. Anyway, next he says, also a very good example is Dr. Anthony Chaffee I noticed there's a lot of doctors here. There's no reason to mention that. Just say the guy's name. There's no reason to. Anthony Chaffee, who has been eating 200 grams of protein daily for 20 years, claims to feel just as good in his 40s compared to his 20s. Well, that's great. He also looks much younger than his biological age. Well, now, if you want to talk about who looks biologically younger, if you want to talk about that, you can do this through just observations. Look at David Sinclair. Look at Walter Longo. There's a lot of other people that are either caloric restriction. Look at the Caloric Restriction Society. They look a little bit older while they're in that state. But if they eat some carbohydrates for 2 or 3 days and fill out, you'll notice they have shockingly low amount of wrinkles for their age. This is certainly not, you're not observing this correctly. If you look at people who eat high protein diets or who work out, especially you lift weights, they almost always look older than they are, even the ones that don't take steroids. Then he says, there are studies correlating low protein to better health in humans which cannot be dismissed. However, I'm not completely sold. Honestly, brother, you shouldn't be sold on the human studies. Those you can poke holes in, honestly. You can poke holes in those, and if you could, it's not that. It's the studies on all species. It's a consistent thing. When your body thinks you're fed, it is not repairing cells as much. It's just true, honestly. This is on average true, obviously. Depends on the person. Anyway, the rest of the question is a bit long, but he mentions basically that he doesn't think we have firm enough conclusions to make decisions upon our lifestyles, but that if we were prioritizing longevity, we might eat less protein, but maybe don't go so far as to do what Walter Longo recommends. I recommend against that. I think what Walter Longo recommends is very safe. I've tried it myself. Listen, guys, before I started lifting weights last year and sort of distracted myself, before that, for about 2 years, I ate a very low protein diet. But I was not a vegan. I have no ethical issues with eating meat. I was eating meat almost daily, but I was eating mostly organ meat and sometimes eggs. I felt the best I felt. A lot of people comment on the channel. They see those videos where I was very skinny in those videos. They say, wow, you look much healthier these days. They don't mean it in a bad way. These subscribers are like, oh, things look better for you. No, I'm much less healthy now than when I was skinny in those videos, looking tired or gloomy or whatever. And I had way more energy in those videos. I felt completely great. So I can tell you, as long as you're not micronutrient deficient or you have some problems with your diet that you're not considering, if your diet's well designed, you're not going to feel worse. And to the person who wrote the question, asked specifically, your organs are not going to specifically degrade that rapidly from a diet like that. Your organs might degrade from a calorically restricted diet, but that's not what Walter Longo recommends. Caloric restriction means always being below maintenance. That will cause some kind of effect. But Walter Longo recommends cyclically lowering nutrients to get into the repair pathways and to keep meat or protein consumption within a reasonable range. You're still getting enough protein to maintain the health of your organs. Do you understand what I mean? Next, a question from Vika Aesthetic. He says, Leo, can you please put into perspective what you mean when you say a low protein diet? He says, I mean, what are the numbers we are targeting? He says, also, when we bring down protein, we essentially have to replace that macro with either carbohydrates or fat. But replacing them with carbs means higher blood glucose levels and higher insulin, provided 50% of the population is already insulin resistant, which leaves us with a lot of confusion. High protein means high mTOR, high carbs mean high insulin, and high fats mean high LDL. Great question. Okay, Vika, first of all, because Vika is from Indian descent, I wanted to mention that the kind of diabetes involved among subcontinental Asians like Indians, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, and Pakistanis is a bit unique. I want to one day do a video on this kind of diabetes among Indians. I have some very interesting papers I've saved over the years about this subject. I'd love to do a video on it in the future. Among Indians, it is truly a concern of diabetes is a serious concern, or insulin resistance is a really serious concern. Indians, like Arabs and some other ethnicities, have a serious predisposition toward diabetes, which may be made worse by the national diet, which is oftentimes lacto-vegetarian among Hindus at the very least. Now, about the amount of protein we're consuming to have a low protein diet, we're talking about something like, something like 50 to 100 grams of protein in the diet. If it's from animal protein, maybe the max would be around 80 grams of protein in the diet, something like that. It doesn't really matter how big the person is that much, I think, but it's below 100 grams of protein irrespective of the size. That's what I mean there. Now, when you remove protein from the diet, that's true. You have to replace it with either carbohydrates or fats. Now, if you're thinking of refined carbohydrates or fats, I understand why you're thinking this way. But if you're thinking of plants, fruits, and vegetables specifically, raising the carbohydrates may affect your insulin levels, but as we see from studies, it doesn't cause increases in IGF-1. Not the carbohydrates, just the total calories consumed. So it shouldn't cause the kind of damage that higher potentially insulin signaling or glucose in the blood would cause to cancers and so on. What I'm saying is having a higher amount of carbohydrate in your diet may be protective. Also, having a higher amount of fat in your diet, depending, as I said earlier, on the kind of fat you have, may also be protective. If you're eating mostly lauric saturated fats or polyunsaturated fats that have already oxidized or something like that, you may be damaging your health, or you'll also maybe raising LDL through the saturated fats. But there are other fats which may improve your health. And so if you're eating mostly walnuts and pecans, you don't really have to be too concerned about your LDL cholesterol. So it really depends on the foods you consume is what I think is the most important issue. If you're focused on your health, and then within those foods, you can try to gain as much muscle as you can. That way you're being healthy, and having that muscle that comes from having a healthy diet is also healthy. Next, we have a question from Christ Varg. He says, "Hey Leo, my question is, how would you maximize muscle growth by implementing the things you said in the video from a longevity perspective?" That's a great question, Chris. We can basically break this down into the idea. I wouldn't focus on the FGF21 issue too much, except the elements of FGF21, which we learned, which can affect how I would go about gaining maximal muscle if I didn't care about longevity. The elements that I would take into account are this. I would never supplement with EAAs, ever. I would never buy those again. I would never buy BCAAs. And I would, unrelated to FGF21, but related to mTOR, I would potentially supplement with arginine. I would potentially supplement with glutamine. And it's not easy to supplement with methionine, but I would also supplement with leucine, potentially the D-leucine form, which is two leucines attached together. What I would do particularly is this. To grow the most in the long term, I basically want my receptors fresh, and I want mTOR turned on. So I would want to turn on mTOR for long periods, but I would want to introduce periods where mTOR is turned off so that everything refreshes. Sort of the same approach I have to anabolic steroids. I like short esters because you don't have to adapt to having large amounts of testosterone enanthate in your system to where you need to bump it so much to get a result due to downregulation of androgen receptors. Not all receptors in your body downregulate as a response to agonism, but many do. In my experience, I think the problem with having mTOR on all the time is maybe some downregulation, but mainly a development of insulin resistance. So what I would do personally is, depending on how much growth hormone I'm using really, how much visceral fat I have and so on, I might fast using my how to shrink your waist kind of plan. I might fast once every 2 months, once every 3 months, something like that, to maintain my insulin sensitivity. I also would time restrict my eating. I would never wake up in the middle of the night to drink a protein shake, for sure. Even if I wanted to gain the most amount of muscle, because that'll get you to insulin resistance way faster. Remember, who did that? To give you an example, somebody who used to wake up in the middle of the night, drink their protein shake, Dave Palumbo. Search Palumboism to see the effects of that. When you get so insulin resistant like that, you're stuck. You can't just keep, your liver cannot digest protein 24 hours a day. It cannot do it. So you can't be doing that 24 hours a day. If you wanted to digest stuff very well and partition your food well, limit the hours that you eat. So what I might do if I wanted to grow the most overall, I might eat like 10 to 12 hours a day, beginning upon rising and ending a few hours before bed. I may take 24 hours off eating maybe once a week. And I may do my kind of 3 to 5 day fast, depending on what PEDs you're using, maybe once every 2 to 3 months. That would keep me growing at the maximal rate, I believe. Next, Keanu Perez says, I was wondering, as someone who just started carnivore, how would this affect someone like me? And is there a shift in how the body ages when you're eating virtually zero carbs with high protein compared to eating high carbs with high protein? Very curious. Keanu, I don't think there's a study comparing this. But I think you're right. As I mentioned earlier, I think that the main issue will be that on a carnivore diet, you guys will be eating less total calories than you would have otherwise. And this will reduce IGF-1 signaling, mTOR signaling, the nutrient sensing pathways on its own. But there may be other issues involved. I do think that eating higher animal protein with much less carbohydrates is probably safer than eating higher animal protein with carbohydrates. For cancers, for aging, for everything. Next, we have a question from York51. He says, "Hi Leo, great videos on protein consumption. I'm just wondering, would somebody who lives a more physically taxing lifestyle, i.e. construction job, lifting, etc., be able to get away with having a higher intake of protein with less negative results since the body is more frequently in need of muscle repair? I feel great on a high protein diet, but your research has definitely has me take a second look at my choice." This is a very interesting question. First of all, one day we should make a video on how exercise, when it's related to your job, when it's the kind of exercise that your body expects, how that exercise affects your health less than other kinds of exercise. I think that's an interesting subject. Second, the fact that you need more protein isn't a very good sign. Needing more protein means that your proteostasis mechanism, the mechanism of maintaining the right proteins in your body, will be more rapidly changing. So if you need more proteins, your body is degrading more proteins in your body, committing autophagy. If you raise your protein consumption, now it's degrading more proteins, consuming more proteins, doing both of that all the time. So there's a flux of proteins constantly. This makes it very difficult, I'm quite certain, to turn off mTOR. But also may make it more likely that you develop misfolded proteins in different parts of your body. You see what I mean? So it may not be desirable to need that many proteins in the first place. But if you did need that many proteins due to your job, there's a difference between having high amounts of calories activating mTOR. So if you have a very physically active job and your maintenance calories are actually 5,000 and you consume 5,000, it may be less damaging for your cellular health than somebody who actually only burns 3,000 calories but consumes 5,000. On the other hand, even if you burn 5,000 calories, if those calories come from carbohydrates versus protein, your growth pathways in your body will be less activated. You don't need the full amount from protein, right? Having less protein during your day means less activation of those pathways. Also, even if you burn all the calories from the protein that you consume during the day, the protein still activates mTOR. So if you were supplementing protein throughout your workday, even if you burnt all the calories, mTOR is turned on fully, because it's sort of like this. Amino acids like leucine and methionine are sort of like hormones. It doesn't matter whether they got degraded afterwards, they activated mTOR. It's going to be on for a few hours now. And unfortunately, you're going to consume more protein in a few hours because you eat throughout the day, like these bodybuilders have been advising people, and therefore mTOR is going to stay on. You see what I mean? So basically my answer here is that I think if you have higher caloric demand and even having a higher protein demand, doesn't mean that you're safe from consuming more protein or protein more frequently during the day. Remember guys, the worst thing is the frequency of protein consumption, protein that contains leucine and methionine. Usually this is either a supplement or an animal protein. It's the frequency. If you had all your protein in one meal, you'd have an opportunity to get mTOR turned off later on during the day and have cellular repair. It's that frequency throughout your day which would still be damaging for you even if you expend more calories due to your job. Alright friends, for the next questions, I collected these in various random places, so I don't have the names of the people who asked the questions, but I'll try to go through them nonetheless. There's one that says, "Leo, you said lithium carbonate causes kidney failure but might lower mTOR activity. What do you think about lithium orotate on health extension?" First of all, lithium does lower mTOR activity in the brain specifically. It certainly does. It's a glucose synthase kinase modulator and has many other healthful impacts on the body systemically and on the brain specifically. But this is at high doses of lithium. Well, it's certainly true at high doses. It may be true at very low doses. There are these interesting soil lithium studies that are related to cognitive health. But the doses used here are between 400 milligrams or so, at the very least, I think, to around a gram, 1,200 milligrams, something like that of lithium. At that dose, over about a 20 to 30 year period, the lithium will cause kidney failure. It does in most people, and as I mentioned before, most of us will eventually experience kidney failure if we live long enough, so we want to protect the health of our kidneys. Lithium orotate is actually more kidney toxic than lithium carbonate, but better absorbed. So at the moment, we don't really know whether lithium orotate is less kidney toxic per amount of lithium absorbed? We don't actually know, at least as of the last time I researched this subject. So I don't supplement with lithium myself. You can access some of these similar pathways through SSRIs and through other approaches like sodium valproate, which there was another question asking, does sodium valproate manipulate the GABA system? It does. Sodium valproate manipulates sodium channels, basically causing the brain to act as a sink for GABA. So there's more GABA in the brain, but it doesn't directly modulate the GABA receptors. So it's not nearly as dangerous as GABA A receptor modulators like benzos or Z drugs like zolpidem and those drugs that put you to sleep. And also it does not modulate the GABA B receptors like the GABA B agonists, phenibut or baclofen. It instead just causes the brain to have more GABA, and so it's much more sustainable, I think. It's easier to get on, titrate up slowly. You don't have as much of an acute effect. When you have less of an acute effect with the drug, you usually have less tachyphylaxis. Tachyphylaxis is diminishing marginal returns the longer you use the drug. So sodium valproate is a better option. There are a few better options also. Lithium is a great option for short term, like 1 to 2 year treatment for people who are very suicidal or really they have treatment resistant depression. Someone also asked for natural bodybuilding. How would you refresh insulin sensitivity? What would you do? I have to say that for natural bodybuilders, I think that they become less insulin resistant than bodybuilders who use PEDs, specifically bodybuilders who use growth hormone. Androgens make you less insulin resistant. Growth hormone makes you much more insulin resistant. When we're talking about naturals, I would still consider doing sort of the same thing, but maybe less frequently. So I might take a day, maybe if I took a day off eating every week, I might only fast once or twice a year, once every 6 months or something like that. I might not need to take a day off every week. You know, I would still probably only eat 10 to 12 hours a day. It would be a bit similar, but you honestly won't come across that serious insulin resistance that happens with bodybuilders who are eating, you know, over 4,000 calories every day and taking growth hormone, and especially if they're taking insulin also. Remember, insulin also makes you insulin resistant. Many people forget that. Okay, let's take a couple of more questions, just because I have many more questions actually that I collected from random places, not on the individual posts, but I think the video is getting a bit long. So first of all, what would be worse for aging, protein or carbohydrates? It depends on the individual context, but in general, as a macronutrient category, having an excessive protein is worse for aging across species than having an excessive carbohydrates. Next, a question, if crushing your mTOR levels can reduce your chances of cancer, would it be advised for people who are extremely prone to getting cancer to do this? Absolutely, absolutely. That's the number one strategy to lower your risk of getting cancer in your life. The number one strategy is to lower mTOR. Having less sugar in your diet lowers mTOR. Having less insulin signaling lowers mTOR. Having less protein in your diet lowers mTOR. Having caloric restriction, not eating a lot of calories like obese people who get cancer a lot, lowers mTOR. The most powerful ways to avoid cancer, if you're a 20-year-old or 30-year-old, is to make sure you've lowered mTOR as much as you can during your life. So the problem is, of course, if you keep it always lowered, as we discussed before, the atrophy of organs, you should at least do the cyclical lowering of mTOR to get cellular repair pathways activated. You may want to use some drugs or supplements that can localize raised mTOR in your brain, or not in your heart. I don't know about options that do so in your heart, but in your brain, and therefore you can have even lower mTOR systemically, but slightly higher in your brain. So, you know, protecting yourself from cancer a little bit if you're not particularly concerned with brain cancers. But yeah, that's the approach. Lowering mTOR is the approach to avoid cancer in general. And the approach to get cancer is either to be obese, because the actual fat that obese people has itself causes damage to the body, not just the fact that they eat a lot, but either to be obese or to be very muscular. Those are the two ways to get cancer, the quickest ways. And you guys may not know this, but a ton of bodybuilders have gotten cancer. They just don't publicize it. They don't publicize it. So you guys don't know about how many bodybuilders have gotten cancer, but let's say out of the top 5 bodybuilding coaches, I think 3 or 4 out of them have gotten cancer. Many bodybuilders that I know or had close friends who were close to have had cancers. Frequently, these are skin cancers, because melanoma is the cancer that develops the most from IGF-1, but there are other cancers also. Next, we have a question asking, will a high-protein diet really take 20 years off one's life? We should answer that. No, I don't think so. Not in the general case. You may be someone really predisposed to cancers. In that case, it may cause you to get cancer earlier, which may make you die 20 years younger. I don't think any dietary change in general will extend human life by 20 years. It seems to be the case that dietary changes extend life less the bigger an organism is. So dogs have less life extension than rodents, and we would have less life extension than dogs. This is what we think at the moment. So really, these dietary changes may extend your life by 2 to 5 years at max. The difference though is that for those 20 years between 40 to 60 or 30 to 50, you will feel way younger than you would have otherwise. That's what we really think may happen. And that's why I would eat a lower protein diet. Because I'm already starting to feel the effects of the high protein diet for years. I'm talking a lot from personal experience. My father doesn't have these, or didn't have the same amount of aches and pains, and my mother didn't when they were in their 30s. I did this to myself, and I lived a very difficult life in many regards, but the protein consumption and the weightlifting I noticed the effects as they came, and I'm certain that it caused a kind of senescence-related inflammation and inflammaging for me, and I don't want you guys just to go through it without knowing that it would happen. If you make the choice anyway, at least you knew it would happen. I didn't know. He also asked, what if you're doing a growth period and once you reach the desirable amount of muscle mass, you just try to maintain and start fasting and activating AMP kinase, etc. That's a great strategy, I think, personally. When I was muscular, I started lifting again for about 4 months this time. I didn't get to my full muscular size. But when I actually was muscular and I stopped weightlifting, I stopped weightlifting for over 6 months without losing much muscle. As I kept testosterone in for a period of time at about 400 milligrams a week, which to me at the time was like, I thought it was TRT. But I was not losing, my arms were still 18.5 inches at a low body fat. Until I completely removed the testosterone and wasn't working out, and also I had low protein diet, then the muscle started losing. You'd be surprised how easy it is to regain muscle you've had. As you guys can see, I worked out for only 4 months a little while ago, and I regained quite a bit of muscle quickly, not the full amount, but quite a bit. And also how easy it is to maintain muscle once you get it. The key though is that you don't want to maintain a high protein diet because you're signaling for mTOR. So what I would do personally is I would consider gaining the amount of muscle I want from androgens or without androgens, and then I would consider maybe having a low androgen long-term plan, something similar to TRT that's not as dangerous, and we know there are certain PEDs that are less dangerous than others. I wouldn't use growth hormone and insulin long-term, and I would consider having a lower protein diet and maybe using protein selectively throughout the day. There's certain periods in which I want higher protein and other periods I don't, and you could maintain the muscle. You don't have to have, so you could gain the muscle and then maintain it. You'd be surprised, you don't have to have 200 grams of protein a day to maintain muscle. And you don't have to have even very high calories. You'll maintain a lot of the muscle at lower calories and with lower protein. And you would also then maintain those cellular repair pathways. Now you'd have more muscle on your body, which means you'd have more risk probably of proteostasis issues. Your body has to synthesize more proteins, degrade more proteins. Therefore, it's going to have more, sort of like pollution of proteins in the body. But overall, you'll be way healthier than if you kept protein high. That's for sure. And you also may have better bone mineral density and better a buffer toward poor glycemic control, basically toward diabetes in the future. So there's some benefits as well. Okay, we'll take one last question before we end here. So I got a question from a 17-year-old, which is surprising because I've limited my channel to only 18 plus. But nonetheless, I'm glad this question was asked so I can answer it. He said, should I be worried about fasting as a 17-year-old bodybuilder? What should my plan of action be going forward? If he's serious about bodybuilding, that means that he is an actual bodybuilder, not somebody who is lifting weights for muscular hypertrophy, but he wants to compete on a bodybuilding stage. If that were the case, then I would consider cyclical fasting. I would actually follow the plan I described earlier. I would fast probably 1 day of the week so I could gain the most. I have the best insulin sensitivity. I would probably only eat 8 to 12 hours a day. But for the cellular repair and health, I would consider, not just for insulin sensitivity, I would consider fasting once every 3 months or once every month or minimum once every 6 months, even from his age. Because if I start at that young an age, it's less likely for me to accrue all these damaged cells. These cells with DNA mutations that were never killed because our body always thought it was in a fed state, so apoptosis wasn't going on, or the proteins that are misfolded that weren't eaten. Autophagy, by the way, phagy means eating. So auto means eating yourself. So the proteins that weren't eaten, all these kind of, or senescent cells that weren't killed, all these kind of things that we accrue over time from having mTOR turned on all the time, that happens in bodybuilders, which is why bodybuilders look like they age faster than they actually should. Or well, there's many reasons for that. But anyway, all of these things could be limited by going through the fasting periods. The problem is if this guy is on drugs, it'll be hard to get mTOR turned off. He'll probably need rapamycin to be able to do it. But anyway, if I was 17 and a true bodybuilder, I would consider fasting and all of that. If I wasn't a true bodybuilder, if I was a 17-year-old who wanted muscle mass, I would not consider restricting protein. As I mentioned earlier, I would want to grow fully until I was 25, personally, because I feel like I'd get more health span, more good living out of my life from doing so, even though I may live longer if I reduce protein. And I might fast, actually, but probably not at 17. I might start fasting at like 19 or 20, maybe, cyclically, and not too often, not once a month. Maybe every 6 months or every 3 months, something like that. Anyway, friends, I hope this was helpful for you. I tried to go through your questions and do it in a relaxed manner, although it's always difficult to talk to the camera like it's somebody, but I tried to do so. Hopefully some of this was helpful or informative in some way to you. Next, I'm going to go through some of your suggested video topics to make videos, including one on grief, which I'm very interested in. Hope to see you again soon. Oh, by the way, I wanted to give you guys some updates. So life has been very good over in Southern California recently. My wife's sister came to visit us, and for the first time ever, we have help with our daughter throughout the day. A little bit of help. Even a little bit of help is so refreshing. We're having such a great time getting ready for our move, planning things, researching how to get a mortgage and stuff like that. We know very little about that. By the way, if there are any mortgage or real estate finance experts here, please send me a DM. We're learning so much from subscribers. Anyway, friends, look forward to seeing you again soon with a new video that's not on the protein topic. Thank you so much for bearing with me.